Welcome everyone to Almost Cancelled. I am Peter, and today I'm going to be talking to you about Y: The Last Man, Season 1, Episode 1. It's called The Day Before. I will start spoiler free. In fact, I don't even think there's much to spoil in this first episode, to be honest, but I will start spoiler free. I'll give you warning before I get to spoilers since it's in Episode 1. This is the new FX show that's been a long time coming. They reshot the pilot. This has been in the works for a long time. Multiple showrunners, multiple people on board. Based on the Brian K. Vaughan comic book, which I have read. It's been a long time, admittedly. It's been over a decade since I read that entire series. So I'm not going to claim to remember things particularly well. In fact, I remember broad strokes. I remember some characters. I remember some of the ending beats. But there's definitely things in this episode where I am not sure if they happened in the comic or if I've just forgotten they happened in the comic. And there's definitely characters that I don't really remember if they were like prominent in the comic or if they're new. So I'm not sure this is like I'm not sure like how much my reading of the comic is going to really affect things too much in terms of my critique, outside of maybe just my, because I liked the comic a lot. I loved it. It was one of the best like long running series I'd ever read at the time. So, and Brian K. Vaughan's one of my favorite comic writers. So I have a general, impression of that comic and what it had on me, and a general sort of feeling that I remember whilst I was reading it. So other than just comparing it to that general vibe, I don't really think my comparison to the book's going to be that in depth. Maybe there'll be a few things here or there. I'm sure I'll bring stuff up. But the premise of Y: The Last Man, if you don't know it, is that it's a world where every single man on the planet, barring one, named Yorick, hence the sort of double meaning of the title, Y: The Last Man, dies, right? They just mysteriously die one day, leaving a world full of women, but no men, all but one. Yorick, hence the double meaning in the title, Y: The Last Man. It's also Y for Yorick. But it's purely, defined purely by anything with the Y chromosome other than him and his monkey. Die. So, the actual series, the actual comic book series, it was set in the world after this happens for the most part, and it's the journey that he has to go on, and there's lots of other things. But I won't really get into that because this first episode doesn't get into that. In fact, I think back on a news episode, once, maybe even twice, I actually predicted that when they eventually get around to doing this TV show, that the first episode of the show is probably going to end with the incident. It's going to end with the I don't know, the epidemic. I don't know, it feels weird to call it an epidemic when it just happens instantly like that, but I guess that's what it is. Which, it's kind of, it's got its positives, it's got its negatives. Like, I think it makes it really hard to critique or judge this as a TV show based on this first episode. And it is worth mentioning they did put out the first 3 episodes at once, because that's like a Hulu thing to do, and now FX and Hulu are like, Y and X chromosomes living together, blah blah blah. But they make it really hard to have expectations about the show as a whole based on this first episode. I think the positive of doing it this way, narratively speaking, is that it does make sense from a narrative structure to do that. The funny thing about the comic book, though, now I don't think it started with an issue set in the past, but I think there was one early Sean where they did like the time before the thing happened issue. But a 20-page comic book, give or take, is very different from a full hour-long episode of TV, right? In terms of the actual time you're spending in the world, it's actually a lot more time spent in a TV episode versus a comic. It's why a 6-issue comic book arc tends to translate better to a movie rather than a full season of TV. Because a 20-issue comic doesn't translate to a full hour of TV, generally speaking. It can do, like depending on what it is. I mean, there's give and take, and there's you can mold things and adapt things and all the rest of it. But typically speaking, I would say that an hour of TV is more like 2 or 3 comic book issues at standard length, right? If I was to ballpark, and again, this is not an exact science. There's a lot of variables here. There's a lot of subjectivity here, but if I was to ballpark it, I would say it's like that. So you're spending a lot more time with these characters before the incident where all of the men die. And that's not a spoiler because that's the premise of the show, which is why I say there's not a whole lot of spoilers to actually give for this first episode. I might not even do a spoiler section. The few details I have to kind of avoid, I don't think are even that worth talking about. But this spends a lot of time letting us get to know a bunch of characters, and I think one of the things that stuck out to me is that in the comic book, it definitely was Yorick as the main character, and everyone else was definitely a supporting character. Everyone else was a side character, and he was the main character. Now, I actually kind of appreciate the desire to not do that and to have it be more equal between him and the rest of the cast, because it is kind of weird that you have this premise where all of the men go barring one, so then you then still give most of the story to the one man. Is kind of weird, right? Like, if anything, this should be a chance to really give a spotlight to a lot of female characters and let them really shine, especially since they're the ones who are going to be running this world. And like, how do they deal with a world where half the population suddenly died? And for certain professions, like, that were geared heavily more towards men, how do they function now with, like, I don't know, we'll pick a profession, like, what percentage of pilots are men versus women? So, and that's something you even get a glimpse of in the episode, is that, some people, when they died, were flying a plane. So that's going to cause some issues. But, like, so you've got all that. So obviously there's a lot of interesting science fiction stuff to explore with this society that's going to form after all this. So I completely get that. It was a little bit weird in this first episode, though. Just because I was used to my memory of the comic book, and then this show kind of almost forgetting Yorick exists after a few scenes. Like, he has a few scenes, and I think his big one where he's having dinner with his girlfriend Beth, I think that's like before the halfway mark, and then we spend a long time with other characters. And while I remember his mother, who is like a senator or a congresswoman, and his sister Hero, who's an EMT person, driver, corresponder, whatever, EMT responder, that's the word I'm looking for, in New York. Like, those characters I remember quite vividly from the show, and I remember Agent 355, who is never named that, I think, in this episode, unless there was like a small hint to it that I missed. But I don't think that's a spoiler, because it's just what she's referred to going forward. I am, of course, referring to the black woman who's like an agent, who you think is working for the government, seemingly, given her job with the first time we see her and what happens with that. But then she's also infiltrating the White House by the end, so it's like, oh, who is she working for? That's honestly something I do not remember who she's actually working for from the comic. I do not remember where that went, or what her backstory ultimately turned out to be. I have completely forgotten that from my reading. So, not to say I don't remember a couple of big things with her in the story beats later on, because I do, but I have forgotten that. She's a big part of the comic book. So, but there was definitely a lot of other characters in this that I was like, I can't remember if they were in the comic book. I'm thinking the actress Jess Silguero from The Boys, and I saw her in something else, but she was in the first episode of The Boys. I like her a lot, actually, so I was pleased to see her, but I don't remember a character from the comic book. Marin Island's character, who was recently in what do we call it, Umbrella Academy season 2, and she's been in some other things. Like, her character Nora, I don't think I remember her. She works for the president in this. So there's definitely a bunch of characters that I don't really remember from the comics, and some of them might be new, some of them might not be. But it did feel like it was taken, like, I felt like I was spending a lot of time away from the characters that I remember being important. And this isn't really a critique on the show, because, like, this is just purely my own, like, preconceived notion from reading the comic, but also my memory of not even being sure if some of these characters were in the comic. So I can't really fault it for that. I guess what I would say is that all the plot lines individually for each character in this first episode, I wouldn't say or make a lot of them that intriguing on their own. I think Hero comes out being one of the most interesting characters because of what goes down with her in this episode, and maybe what goes down with her is like one of the few spoilery things we could probably talk about for her, like, towards the end of the episode. But she also has one of the more interesting just character attitudes and stuff. Like, she felt like she had a vibe, she felt like she had something going on, I think Yorick right now, based on this first episode where we see him propose to his girlfriend, and he's an escape artist, but he's not making any money. His parents are bailing him out, and so on and so on. He like it's hard to gauge right now. He'll get a lot of time in the future. I do think it's interesting that the one guy who survives all of this is someone as useless as this guy. That is funny, and it's someone who is relatively useless, I have to say, who has no like trade skills, or I can't build things, I can't like do any sort of hard labor skills that are considered manly. I would be useless in this world. I would be useless. So there is kind of a charm in Yorick being the one who can't do anything and has been kind of a layabout. Is going to be the one man who's around. It's kind of funny to me. But there's other characters. There's like a character who is like not working for the president, but she's like speaking out against cancel culture, and she's talking about raising her boys, and she's got like a book signing and stuff. Like that character, I don't remember at all. That seems very specifically current to modern culture, though, so I suspect that she is new, or at the very least, she has been reworked to function in a modern lens. And I know that we're going to have a trans man character on the show. Again, that's something that's been added to explore another avenue that maybe was just ignored in the comic book, which is a good idea. That's a great idea. So I think my two complaints of this first episode is that the pacing feels a bit slow. I don't necessarily think all of the character plots that we spend time on in this are that interesting. And one of the reasons for that is that I think if you know the premise of the show, is that all of the men aren't going to be around, outside of maybe flashbacks and stuff like that going forward. So a lot of it didn't like I almost was tuning out at points when certain men were talking. As dumb as that sounds, because I'm like, well, you're not important. And obviously it does, don't get me wrong, it does focus its attention more on the women in the scenes, because they're the ones who are going to be main characters. They're the ones who are going to be given plot lines that are going to be important. And I like enough of them, certainly. I think yeah, the key ones are probably all at least somewhat interesting so far. I think Agent 355 is interesting from a plot perspective, and I think the actress like carried enough gravitas in her sort of mystique to sort of make me go, ooh, I wonder what she's really working for or doing or whatever. I think I've not remembered all the characters' names yet. So Congresswoman Brown, or Jennifer Brown, I'll just call her Jennifer. It feels weird given her role in the government, but Diane Lane's character, she is going to obviously be very important. She's kind of obviously what she reminds me a lot of, and I remember thinking this when I read the book, is that she reminds me a lot of Rosalind in Battlestar Galactica, in that she is the highest one up in the government when all this goes down, and she ends up effectively becoming the leader. And I can't remember if she's literally the leader, if she's literally the acting president necessarily. It may not be exactly that, but she's at least high enough that she's making a lot of decisions going forward. So her having like a weird history with her ex-husband, or not ex-husband, sorry, her estranged husband who is wanting a divorce, I wasn't super interested in that sequence, right? Even though the actors were doing a fine job. It was just a little bit dull in terms of premise. There was a lot of stuff like that in this episode where I like Christine, which is the Jess actress from who played Robin in The Boys. Like I seem to, she has a couple of moments where she's kind of like trying to be like a good employee for Jennifer, but she's kind of nervous. She gets scared at that one scene with the rats. It's I think she's likable enough, but I don't know how much that is just the actress versus the material, because I don't think the material so far is doing a ton for these characters. Where I'm going to give it praise, because I do think there's positives, and I think the positives that I'm going to give it is mainly in the last 5-10 minutes. Because that last 5-10 minutes, I actually saw evidence of real craft, of real thought that went into how to present it. I thought how it escalated to the moment where every man dies, and that includes the boys, it includes all the children, and so on and so on. I thought was well handled in that the and I guess this is light spoilers. Do you know what, I'll give a light spoiler warning for the rest of this, right? I'll give you a full spoiler warning before I talk about Hero's plot towards the end, but I'll give a light spoiler warning in that I'm going to discuss how they kind of show the people dying towards the end, right? Just in case you want to keep that completely, fresh before you watch it. So the way it does this, where we have characters who are just kind of found already dead, and then we have another character, particularly Ireland's character Nora, right? So Nora, we meet her husband not too far from the end of the episode. She's got kids, and we see scenes throughout the episode of her kind of like working for the president, but she clearly doesn't necessarily agree with him entirely. She's kind of belittled by him a little bit, which I think is obviously a smart thing to do, is to kind of show that all of these women have very different experiences going into this new scenario, where some of them are victims of casual sexism, some of them are more directly in hostile or toxic relationships. They all have, to varying degrees, the different experiences with the men around them. Again, smart to kind of establish that. I don't know how enjoyable a lot of that plotting was throughout the episode, but it was smart in theory to do that on paper. But she is like getting breakfast, or sorry, lunch ready for her kids, right? Because they're going to school. So she's trying to like make some sandwiches, and she's like talks to her daughter and says, "Hey, where's so and so?" And her son is still asleep, presumably in bed with her husband, right? Because she mentions before in the scene that her son crawled into bed with them in the middle of the night, and you know what it's doing, and it immediately builds this anticipation, because you know that for her, the way she's going to experience this is to find both her husband and son dead together. And I guess the other thing you can compare a lot of this to is it's very Leftovers, right? Leftovers, which jumped ahead into the post-Leftover world quite quickly, but we did get a scene of like the initial disappearance happening, and there was various, callbacks to it throughout that show. It's hard not to compare it to that because it's this fairly instant thing. It's not completely instant to the second. Obviously, clearly it affects some men are a few seconds or even a minute after some others. We've seen various people die by the time we finally see the president. But what I liked about the way it showed this and the way it built up is that you started with finding a dead body. You then had anticipation for finding someone who had a bit more emotional weight because they were related to a main character, and it was going to be really, it was going to be painful. The first person we see, I think, is found as the cop that Hero's near, and she sort of sees him lying dead. And then we have this anticipation for Nora finding her family dead. But while this is all going on, we have, like, at the White House, or I think it's the White House, maybe it's the Pentagon, but I think it's the White House, where they're they're in the big meeting room, and everyone's like, the president's there. There's like tons and tons of like people in this room, both men and women alike, and we've got Agent 355's there. She's now at least pretending to be Secret Service. She's there. Christine's there, obviously. But then we have a bunch of just random men in the room, Secret Service, various ranking military officers, and members of the political system. And what's nice about this is that when it actually gives us the big scene of like, this is like chaos and it's just happening around them, is it sort of crescendos to that room. It crescendos from just one dead body to a loved one finding their family, and then it crescendos to the president and every other man in the room dropping dead around the women. And I have to say, as far as the premise goes, I think this scene did a really good job of giving us this shocking visual of all the women sort of being left in shock and obviously being scared and crying because they don't know they don't know they're safe yet, right? So there's obviously a fear it's going to be them. They're obviously terrified because everyone's dropping dead around them, which feels like some sort of like gas attack or something like that. That's what's running through their heads, obviously. So seeing like Christine shocked and looking around and like them. And like, there's a moment where they sort of come out the room and they're being like relocated to like a bunker or something in case it is an attack and in case there's other stuff going on. And they're kind of realizing that it's not just them. Air Force Twos went down and other places are having similar effects. There's a moment where there's like a military officer who's a woman who's sort of directing them, right? and it's like there's almost this kind of like surreal realization as they're realizing that it's just them that's left, right? This is not random. It's all of the women are still alive. And I think them looking around and seeing all the dead men and them sort of like try to fire into kind of like action. And I think this is maybe the one great moment I think Diane Lane has in the episode is Christine starts to freak out and Diane Lane like grabs her and sort of like takes her phone off and says, no, put it away, breathe, be calm. And it's showing us that she is someone who is going to be capable of making decisions, that she is going to keep a cool head, she is going to navigate them through this crisis as best she can, and she is maybe one of the better people to do that. At least we've met in the episode. And I'm sure the scenes that we had with her and the president, where the president's like mad that she called him sexist or something to that effect, in an interview, I'm sure thematically that's all going to, make sense and feed into who she is, and I'm sure it's respectable enough on paper. I don't know how enjoyable those scenes actually were on their own. And part of that's just because I'm like, this president's going to be dead by the end of the episode. I don't care. I don't care. Like, it doesn't matter. So, but really good. Like, this section, this, like, the actual chaos of everything happening at the end, I think is very well directed. And I think the way it's plotted throughout and how it starts with one person, then and it's one, like, random person, effectively. So, it's an extra. It's someone who's just there for a couple of lines. And then it's someone who means something to someone. And then it's, no. The leader of the country is going down and everyone around him. And we're left with this visual. And we get shots on the streets of the plane going down and like mothers like carrying their young boys, their young sons and all that. And I think that was effective. Fair enough. And then just how casually Yorick kind of wakes up at the end is, again, an effective beat in how it's sort of portraying what this show is. So I would say that I would say that there's some really good effective stuff towards the end. But I would be lying if I didn't feel like the episode to actually watch up until that point wasn't a little bit of a slog. The characters aren't so, and I think the concern is that is this just because we're in this pre-incident world where a lot of these characters haven't had as much time spent on them because they're not going to be around, and this is not the characters that are going to be necessarily interacting with each other as much. And I think it's notable that when it is Diane Lane interacting with Christine, or it's Nora throwing a glance at Diane Lane's character, that those interactions feel more important, and those interactions have a bit more of a spark to them, because those are the interactions that are actually going to keep happening. These are the people who are going to be stuck together, working this shit out and dealing with this stuff. That's super interesting, right? And I think those moments give me hope that's what this is, which is still a flaw. It should still be critiqued that the first episode's kind of borked a little bit because of that. But it's definitely the better option at this point than, oh no, this is just what the pacing and how the show is going to feel outside of maybe big moments like the ending of the episode. Because if we immediately return to that pacing, if we immediately return to that level of characters and their drama not being that interesting, it's hard to imagine that it will feel that uninteresting, given that they've all just lost people and given the chaos that they're going to have to try and navigate through. But that is a concern. It is a concern at this point. But that last 5-10 minutes is good. Obviously, the opening of the episode does give you a glimpse of the post-apocalyptic world with Yorick and his monkey. The only thing I'll say about this is that it's perfectly fine. I did think the helicopter falling off the roof that he has to sort of like go and save the monkey from with a big action movie dive felt a bit just tacked on. It kind of felt like they wanted something exciting to happen at the start because they knew the rest of the episode was going to be so just people talking basically for the most part, right until the very end. So they wanted like an action beat here, and honestly it just felt forced. It just felt like, what is this random thing happening that has no bearing on anything and doesn't really drive anything. So that felt a bit weird. I guess the other thing I would say as well is that I realized that I'm not that impressed anymore by doing something that's dystopian or post-apocalyptic just because you've got empty streets with, this type of visual. I've seen this done enough at this point that you're going to have to win me over with the actual characters and plot. So I don't want to say it's like post-apocalyptic fatigue per se, but there was kind of a feeling when I saw all the cars, when it starts with the shots of like all the city streets and all that, I was kind of like, yeah, okay, I've seen it done before. It makes sense you're starting with these shots. And it's not even that long since I did the first episode of Sweet Tooth, which, also had kind of this apocalyptic kind of incident that started the premise of that show. So it definitely doesn't feel that unique premise-wise, even though there's a lot of potential in what the result of this scenario is, which is that it's all women who are now going to be running everything, and what are they going to choose to do, and what are the beliefs that are going to come out of this. And I know from the book that there's going to be some like extreme kind of like cult-esque kind of groups and stuff like that, and what we're going to do with that. And yeah, so all that stuff is interesting. There's so much potential that exists in the stories, and I know they do because I've read them. I just hope that we can keep. I think, like I say, I remember the comic book feeling expertly paced right from the get-go, and this I would not describe as expertly paced, outside of how it unravels the actual incident in that last 5-10 minutes, where I do think it's pretty well done. So hopefully that's something that we can cling to, and maybe episodes 2 and 3 just sort of further prove that like they know what they're doing. And I am going to look at episode 2. Should hopefully be tomorrow. I do have to do Stargirl from this week first, but I'm hoping I'll get both of them done tomorrow. So I'll say spoiler warning here fully and officially, just so I can talk a little bit about Hero's plot. Where she is having an affair with her partner, her driving, her EMT partner, and he, and the actual plot line to start with is very dull, right? He says he's told his wife about her. She asks questions about it a couple of times. He doesn't want to really talk about the details, which is like, okay, he didn't actually tell her. She's going to find out and be mad, and like, how many times have we seen this exact thing play out? And it just, you're just not into it. But she's a likable enough character. Her interaction with her brother Yorick, right? And obviously their mum's Diane Lane, just in case that wasn't clear for anyone who watched the episode, just to connect all the dots. Here are the characters. Like her attitude in that scene with him, I thought was quite good. She kind of calls him out on his shit, very entertaining. I think her attitude here, once she actually starts like throwing stuff at the guy and it escalates, and then she accidentally kills him, right? That's probably the one spoilery thing I'd say is in this episode, outside of because everything else is just the premise. Everything else is just all the men die, right? We all know that's going to happen. I thought this was a pretty well done moment. I genuinely don't remember if it was in the comic. I don't remember if she accidentally killed someone right before the comic, right before the incident in the comic. It seems like something that might have been there, but I don't remember, right? I don't remember. But of course it makes sense that in the chaos that's about to follow, and the fact that all the men are dead anyway, that no one would notice that this guy was murdered rather than killed or died like everyone else, and therefore no one would investigate it and she would get away with it. And that is going to help drive her character, and the guilt of what she's done is going to drive her character. It's one of the most interesting things about the premise in this episode. As far as other big character beats, I glossed over, Yorick proposing to his girlfriend Beth. I think that needs to be mentioned in a big way, because so much of his driving force is going to be wanting to get to Beth, who is going to be in Australia. She's a teacher. She's going to go teach in Australia for a year. And this scene, they have decent chemistry. I think they come off quite bubbly together at first. And then, of course, he says he wants to go with her to Australia for the year, and she immediately starts giving him reasons and excuses why he shouldn't. And you have that kind of feeling like you kind of know where this is going, and he tries to propose, and she just keeps giving him excuses why he shouldn't go. And it turns into, like, he'll hold her back, that she wants to dive into this new part of her life, and particularly uses the phrase meet people. She wants to meet people, which, as a boyfriend who is trying to propose and sort of like maybe keep the one good thing in his life still, intact, which is this relationship, he of course does not take that well. I don't necessarily blame him for not taking that. I mean, for all of his faults, like, it's her saying she doesn't want him to go with her so she can meet people is about the most damning and worst possible thing he probably needs to hear at this particular moment. Now, obviously, if that's how she genuinely feels, then that's, you know, how this is going to have to go, and she should break up with him. Rather than pretending that this is still going to be an ongoing relationship, long distance, or whatever the narrative was before he popped the question. So I think I like the actors in this scene. I like their chemistry. The actual drama of the moment playing out, again, much like the, you know, have you told your wife about us plot with Hero, is a little, you know, just a little tropey, little trite. I guess just these characters in the episode need a bit more spark before it kicked off, right? If you're going to spend the whole episode letting us get to know these people before the incident, then we have to like have a bit more of a spark. And I think in terms of like bold, and in terms of blanket positives, I will say that I do mostly like the cast. Like I like a lot of the faces that are in here, and I like a lot of the charm they bring to their roles. That's really strong potential. It's the pacing of the writing that I'm a little concerned with going forward, based on some of this episode, and the type of like character drama they're dealing with. But I'm hoping that because they're going to be in this completely new science fiction scenario after this, that some of those writing critiques might not be even relevant. So we'll see. We'll see. So I'm not in love with this episode. I think there's potential still there. I think I have every reason to still check out at least the next 2 episodes that are already out, and see how it is. But as someone who, you know, considers the comic book to be one of the best comics that I've ever read, especially, I mean, just in general anyway, but especially in terms of like your original concept comic books, you know, your non-superhero stuff. I don't want to quite say indie, because it was Vertigo, which is, you know, part of DC technically. So, but it's not like the home run that comic book was immediately, right? It's not to that same level, but that's not necessarily like, you know, a deal breaker. That's not like the story's over here. Shouldn't give it a chance. TV shows can develop, TV shows can find their feet, and so on and so on. So I'm hoping that this will take its strengths and continue to get better. It does have a really good cast, like I say, so hopefully it keeps going. Now, I don't think I've talked about everything necessarily, but obviously I'm really curious to see how the plot specifically looks with episode 2, and where we focus our efforts. Like, are we going to jump ahead a little bit, or are we going to do more stuff that's set right after the incident? Because, like I said, the comic definitely started a little bit into the incident. I think it was like several months even. So we'll see how that goes. But that is my thoughts on episode 1 of Y: The Last Man. So hopefully you got something out of this ramble that I dare call a review. You can give me some of your own thoughts and opinions in the comments below. Like and subscribe. It does help out a lot on YouTube if you hit those buttons. It is how YouTube dictates success, so please do hit them. You can also support us financially over at patreon.com/mailedfuzztv for as little as $1 per month, and get some bonuses for your trouble and help keep all the content coming. So go and have a look and see if you're interested in doing that. Get us on Twitter at mailed_fuzz for channel updates, but otherwise that is me. So thank you once again for watching or listening. I always appreciate it. Keep watching TV. Have you got any vanilla?